Here we go with Superpower. Of course, you have a picture of several of the aircraft carriers. This is more modern day America, but this is indicative of the level of power that this country has achieved, and that we have far more aircraft carriers than anyone else in the world. We have pretty much more of everything. I'm sure there are some exceptions to that than everyone else. And this really begins as a result of World War II. We came out of World War II far more powerful than when we went in, and far more powerful than everyone else. And so we are now not only a superpower, but we are the superpower. So as we talk through briefly the end of World War II, there's a handful of really big things to think about. And that is, of course, that Japan, Germany, and all of their allies totally surrendered in this war. Again, unlike World War One, they were all invaded pretty much, and they completely shut it down, and everything is going to change. And so really World War II, unlike World War One, does change the world. Woodrow Wilson would have probably been far more happy with the results of World War II than he really was the results of World War One. You know, he said that World War One's going to change things, and it really didn't change much, at least not for the good. World War II does. Certainly not perfect. There are certainly some bad things that come out of this, but overall the world changed, and changed for the better. So Japan, of course, surrendered. The emperor took over. They'll get a new government. They will get rebuilt by the United States, will help rebuild and clean up some of the mess that was made with the atomic bombs. And Japan will then become a world power economically, not militarily. But they do lose the empire they had built. So they lose Korea, for example, which we'll come back to and talk about later. Germany, you can see on the map, is split in half. There's the eastern half. You see East Germany. I mean, if you were born in the last 3 decades, then there hasn't been an East and West Germany. It was the 90s, early 90s, where they started to unify back together. But there's an East Germany, which was controlled by the Russians. It's basically the area they invaded. And then there's the West Germany, which will be controlled by the other allies, America, France, and the United States. And they each have their own zone, but ultimately those 3 zones will become West Germany. And for decades, again, about 50 years or so, 40 some odd years, those 2 places will be separate countries. One will be communist, one will be capitalist, if you will. And of course, Berlin is a challenge because Berlin's actually in East Germany, but they're going to divide Berlin up into 4 zones also, but ultimately an East Berlin and a West Berlin. So you could actually live in West Berlin, and it would be like you were living in West Germany, but if you went outside of the confines of the city, then you were back in East Germany. And so it was difficult. We actually almost went to war with Russia. They will blockade Berlin for about a year or so in 1948, 1949. And we almost came to blows. There's a big airlift, and it's pretty crazy, but fortunately we did not. And so again, until the 90s, Germany is split in half. We used to watch the Olympics when I was a kid, and there would be East Germany and West Germany competing against everyone else. And of course, one of the other big things that comes out of Germany, we talked in a previous lecture about the concentration camps, the killing, genocide of these Jews and Gypsies and other groups of people. And by the way, that's not the only place where that sort of thing happened, but in terms of the camps, Germany is where this is going on. There were camps in other places, but they were German camps. We get the Nuremberg trials, which is this process that are in some ways still going on today, where they decided, because of this unique situation, that this wasn't just war. When a war ends, people go home, but when people commit what are called war crimes, they go on trial. And they decided that a number of German leaders, officers, people that worked at these camps were in fact criminals, and so they went on trial. And even today, if they find someone who escaped justice back then, they will still put them on trial, even though these men, mostly men, but some women, are in their 90s. And it is to prove the point, again, that these things are completely unacceptable. Even though war, of course, is war, war crimes are a whole nother level. So the Nuremberg trials, and again, they last for a long time. especially at the beginning of this period of time. And the Russians and everybody's involved, everybody's helpful in this process. And I would just add that Stalin and Churchill and of course Truman and all the other allies were pretty helpful in setting all these things up. One thing I didn't put in here was the United Nations. That gets created also, and we will join, unlike the League of Nations, but it's kind of the same idea, but some of the powers have veto power over anything the UN does. So I think Russia and China and France and Britain and America all have veto power, unlike what was the case with the League of Nations. And that might explain why the UN doesn't necessarily seem to be all that helpful, because the way, as we're going to see, the way the world worked out is there's definite sides to the world now. We're not all in it together, so to speak, that we have the Russians and the Americans. And we'll get into what's called the Cold War, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Another aftermath of the war is what happens with China. Remember, China was invaded by Japan. China was an ally of the United States and the British and Russia. But the reality was that China was already in the middle of its own civil war when the Japanese invaded, and that was between communist Chinese and not communist Chinese. I'll explain why I use that term in a minute. But you got the communist Chinese and the not communist Chinese, and they will sort of agree to stop fighting while the Japanese have invaded. But once Japan surrenders, and then everything starts to go back to normal, well, they'll go back to it. They'll go back at it. And unfortunately, I think for a lot of people, the communist Chinese will win, and they are the purple in this particular map. Usually think of red China, but they are purple on this map. The not communists, at least the ones who can, will go and live in Taiwan. You see the little orange island off the coast of China. Taipei is the capital. Beijing's the capital of China. And so this little island is called Taiwan. And so the not communists will go there. And that's going to have a huge impact on the world going forward. We're still dealing with issues related to China today. Other things across the world, there will be wars in Greece, Yugoslavia. A lot of this kind of thing is going to happen in the area we know of as the Balkans, Albania. And because there were a lot of resistance movements to the Germans and the Italians in those places, and those resistance movements would be made up of communists who are fighting the Nazis or the Italians, there would be nationalists, there would be various ethnic groups, religious groups. Remember, in Yugoslavia, there's Croatians and Serbians and Montenegrins, and then you add the religious component where there's Muslims and Christians and others, and they all fight with each other. It's a mess. But all of them were fighting the Germans and the Italians. And so, just like with Russia, they became allies of the British and the United States. And so we were helping them, and they were fighting against the Germans. Sometimes they also fought against each other. It's kind of messy. But when the war ended, a lot of the communist groups are going to continue to fight because they tended to be very popular. And in Yugoslavia, the communist groups are going to win out. In Greece, the communist groups are going to try to win out, but the British and the Americans are going to kind of hold that down. And this kind of develops a new way of thinking in the world, and that is, hey, we've got to put a stop to communism. We can't let communism grow. Another thing that comes out of World War II, unlike World War I, is, in this case, it's called the Marshall Plan, where the United States is going to invest billions of dollars. I think the total is $13 billion, and that's in 1940, 48, 1950 money. It's hundreds of billions of dollars now, probably. And it's called the Marshall Plan because it comes from a General Marshall, and he says, look, the problem in the world is poverty and that kind of thing, and this war has left Europe in particular devastated. It's true, it left a lot of places devastated, but we're going to focus on Europe. And so you can see these kind of stacks of money where we are going to invest huge amounts of money, again, to our allies, right? But we're going to rebuild West Germany, all these other groups. Italy, again, Italy changed sides, remember, at the end of the war. Now, do notice that the Soviet Union, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Finland, those countries are not going to get in the money. It's not because the money wasn't really offered. It's because Stalin will not take it. He doesn't want the influence of this Western money going into his countries. And unfortunately, what that means is those people will remain poor, those economies will remain very difficult. So part of it's because that's what communism does. The appeal of communist is it's going to make everybody equal. The problem and the reality of communism is it makes everybody equally poor. That's what it always does. And so Stalin doesn't want the influence. He doesn't want America's influence. He doesn't want the money's influence. And so he refuses it. And in fact, if you were in West Germany and you looked across the border to East Germany, it was night and day. By the 1950s, Germany is a vibrant, Western, big economy. East Germany is still East Germany. It looks like you're still in 1940, and all the way until the 1980s and 90s, when especially the 90s, when the merger happens, it still looks like you're in the 1940s. It's almost black and white. So the Marshall Plan is going to give a bunch of money to these countries. Now, this is different than the money we loaned in World War I, which they still haven't paid back, right? This is an investment in those nations because we realize that if we help those nations survive, one, that will help them do better and in turn help us do better. We'll kind of avoid, hopefully, another Great Depression. But two, it also stands as kind of a wall against communism, that countries that are doing well are not going to be inclined toward communism. At least that's the hope. So that's the Marshall Plan. We're going to invest all this money in those countries. But again, note, none of it goes to the communist countries. And it's because they don't want it. The offer is there, but they don't want it. So we're in this period now called the Cold War. You see a picture of John Kennedy, and the bald guy is is Khrushchev. That's his last name, Khrushchev. And don't try to spell it. But these two guys kind of represent the Cold War. Now, naturally, the Cold War it starts before Kennedy comes on the scene, and it lasts well into the 1980s and maybe even the early 90s. It's an era that I grew up in, believe it or not, and I know some of you did too. And what the Cold War is, and it's the term for a war. In this case, it's a war between the United States and its allies, so all those Western countries, Britain, France, etc., versus Russia or Soviet Union and its allies, and that would be China and North Korea and so on. And it's a war between those two groups, though we never actually physically go to war. The US and Russia never go to war directly with one another. Instead, we're going to have all these other little wars called the proxy war. So we'll talk about Korea, we'll talk about Vietnam later. There's several other ones. The first Afghan war, for example, in 1979. Those are all parts of this kind of proxy war. We never actually go to war with the Soviets. And a big reason is the problem of nuclear weapons. So one of the things that happens and develops during this time, and I want to be really clear on that. That's why I have no picture on this one. This is just some words. They're basically what develops, and this is true on both sides, but I'm looking at it from an American perspective here. We're going to view the world as either communist or not communist. So you can see the list, right? You have the Soviet Union, you have red China or purple China from our map earlier. That's the People's Republic of China. Isn't it a little funny that communist countries always have some form of people's or democratic or republic? So you've got the United Soviet Socialist Republics, you've got the People's Republic of China. North Korea calls itself the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea. That's crazy. You go all the way down, Vietnam, Hungary, Yugoslavia, and eventually Cuba will be added to this list. And then on the not communist side, and I choose these words purposefully, of course, is the United States, is the United Kingdom, is France, but really it's everybody else. You are either a communist or you are not a communist, right? So you could be a terrible dictator, the most horrible human being on the earth, and all of that, but if you are not communist, you're going to be on the not communist side. And what happens is anytime there's a conflict between communists and not communists, we are going to help the not communists. And that is what characterizes all of the wars that are going to take place between 1945 and basically the Gulf War, all right, in 1991. And that's a whole new era, a whole new enchilada that we'll get to later. So keep in mind, though, that America, France, Britain, all the big boys are looking at the world through this lens, And we're assuming that all the people on the communist side are all the same. Like the Russians and the Chinese, we're assuming that they're exactly the same. Well, they're not. Any more than we should assume that the United States and Britain are the same. They're not. France, we're not the same. We're similar, but we're not the same. And so we kind of treat them all the same, and we put them in this box. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of decisions are made based on this kind of what I think is a skewed view of the world. And we don't really address these countries as individuals until way into this period of time, the 1970s probably. So we make decisions based on you're either a communist or you're not a communist, not on are you a good country or not, are you a good leader or not so much. So part of this whole Cold War, of course, involves these atomic weapons. This is an arms race. We can call it the arms race. It's certainly the most dangerous arms race, but arms races happen all the time. You can see, of course, we detonated 2 atomic bombs in Japan in 1945 and numerous tests before and after that. The Soviet Union detonated their first atomic bomb in 1949. It's a matter of time before they get it. This technology, like every technology, is a kind of Pandora's box. Once it's open, you can't put it back. So it's only a matter of time before other countries figure out how to do it. But it's not just figuring out the theory, you also have to have the capability, the technology, and the money. So today, even so, not many countries actually can do this. We're going to then develop, of course, the next wave, which is a hydrogen bomb, which is bigger. A couple of years later, 1953, the Soviets detonate their first hydrogen bomb. Of course, the French and the British have this technology. They're behind us a little bit. We've shared some of it. Pretty soon, China in the mid-50s, later 50s, they're going to start detonating their own bombs. Today, there's about, 8, 9 countries, Pakistan, India, unfortunately, maybe Iran, and, of course, North Korea. They all have China. They all have some capability to weaponize these things. Of course, you still have to deliver them, and that's a whole nother story. But the point here is there's this arms race that begins over the next several decades. And so you got, again, the US and Russia and all their allies. And we will never come to blows directly with Russia because the fear is if we do, we will launch our nuclear weapons and we will destroy everything. And that's part of this massive retaliation idea, mutually assured destruction. And what massive retaliation means, in part, as you see on the screen, it's too great of a risk to actually use nuclear weapons. So it's kind of a deterrence between World War III or for World War III. We haven't had World War III, so that's good. No one's detonated atomic bombs in war since we did it in 1945. Another part of massive retaliation, sort of the other side of this, is if someone gets too far out of line, then the threat is they will get nuked, and you don't survive that. And so it does act as a kind of deterrent. So we're going to end up, as I said earlier, with these proxy wars, these small wars like Korea, Vietnam, first Afghan war, and a few others. They don't encompass the whole world. There's fighting that's in one place at one time for a few years, and then it's over. It's devastating and horrible, as all wars are, but perhaps one of the reasons we haven't gone to World War III is the fear that everyone will get destroyed. And so another thing that comes up here is the containment policy is created out of all this. It goes back to the Russians and the Americans and the British. We fought together during the war, we cooperated, and again, I would argue Stalin was very cooperative and very helpful during the war, but when the war ends, he has a very different agenda than we do, right? And you begin to see the cracks forming in the relationship. The Russians are going one way and we're going the other way. We divided Germany, we divided Korea, we end up dividing Vietnam in half. And there's a communist part and a not communist part. And so as time passes, this begins to show that, you know what, Stalin may be just as bad as Hitler, maybe worse than Hitler. And so we have to accept communism where it is, right? We had to accept Eastern European occupation by Russia. That was the price we paid to keep Russia in the war, remember? And we have to accept a certain amount of that in Asia. And, you know, the challenge then is how do we stop it from spreading? So that idea develops into what's called the containment policy. It is a big overarching policy that just simply says we're not going to let communism spread to any new places in the world. And we're sort of partially successful at doing that, some places more than others. So if you were with me in History 1301, we talked about the free soil component of the Republican Party, and they just said we're not going to let slavery spread to any new territories. This is exactly the same idea, but with communism. So it's called the containment policy. We're going to do whatever it takes to contain communism. That means we're going to have to build a military and keep building new weapons and keep a large military in place. We're going to have to keep military assets in Europe, in Japan, in the Pacific, all over the world to counter the military assets that the Soviets and the Chinese have in their regions too. So that's why we're going to stay this time. So we don't leave Europe, we don't leave Asia like we did after World War I. We're going to stay. And that's both an economic boom for those countries, but it's somewhat of a drain on the United States. On the other hand, our economy is so good, at least for a few decades, we don't really even notice. But that gets us directly to the Korean War. The Korean War evolves out of this new world, right? Where the communists and the not communists are going at it. And it's a war of philosophy and politics, but sometimes it breaks out into actual war. So the Korean War, sometimes referred to as the Forgotten War, is the first of these proxy wars. And basically what happens, we don't have the time to stay on it too long, is that Korea, when it was spun out of Japan's empire, is going to be divided in half. So the Soviet Union will administer the northern half, and what do you know? The northern half becomes communist. The Americans are going to administer the bottom half, and so they have their own government, and we're going to help out. And then North Korea is going to invade South Korea in the mid-1950, and Truman is going to go, we got to stop that. This is containment policy. We can't let communism spread, so we can't let communism go into South Korea. The UN is on board. And so the UN sends a force to Korea to stop North Korea from invading South Korea. Of course, 90% of those troops are American. Truman's all on board. I think many Americans were on board, but the ones that weren't saying anything. It's the 1950s. Nobody questions anything in the 1950s. It's all about fear and conformity, and we're worried about the Russians and we're scared of the Russians. So unlike in the 60s where everyone questions everything, I would argue in the 50s, nobody really questions much at all. So we're going to intervene. We're going to go there. There's going to be a 3-year war. It's brutal. Some like 45,000 Americans are killed. It's not going to really happen on TV because TV is not a huge thing yet, and the reporting's not going to show up like Vietnam does. And I think that also helps understand why people had a different reaction and why people just don't remember it. You may be familiar with the TV show MASH, which is set in the Korean War, but of course it's written in the 70s, and it's really sort of a protest against the Vietnam War, but they couldn't do that, so they put it in Korea. But both wars are very similar. In the end, we're going to invade North Korea. That's going to activate Chinese forces. China then gets involved. And of course, China's also back there. Russia's also back there, you know, in the distance. And basically, the United States and the UN said, oh, we got to get out of North Korea. The point of this war, and remember, it's all about containment policy. Containment policy says we can't let communism spread. Think about this. The objective in Korea is not to invade North Korea. The objective is to make sure North Korea doesn't invade South Korea. And those are two very different things, aren't they? And when the war's over, we end up with one army, ours, parked on the southern side of the border, and the North Korean army, with support from China and Russia, parked on their side of the border. And that's where we've been since 1953. So what is it, 2020, 67 years? Is that right? My maths are correct. I'm a history guy, not a math guy. For 67 years, we've been at war in Korea. Many of you probably have had the pleasure of serving this country and spending some time in Korea. Some people love it, some people hate it, but we are technically still at war. Now I would ask the question, if we were in class, I would ask you, did we win? And most people would shake their head, no, we didn't win this war. We're still at war, still there. But if you think about it in terms of what the objective was, we absolutely accomplished the objective. We prevented communism from spreading into South Korea. Now, is that a victory? It depends on who you ask. Is it satisfying? No. It certainly doesn't feel like World War II, where we had total dominance. And unfortunately, until maybe very recently, this is going to be the mode of operation. It's not about winning like we did in World War II. It's about holding against the communists. And I would also add this to this war. This war comes right on the tail end of World War II, where in the beginning of the war, we watched Russia too, but Germany, Japan, and Italy start taking little pieces of other countries, and nobody did anything. And by the time anyone intervened, it broke out into a huge world war. So I think Korea is a little bit of, we remembered what happened in World War II. And so as soon as North Korea invaded South Korea, bam, we jumped on it and said, we're not going to let this happen. We nipped it in the bud. But it's also in keeping with containment policy, containing communism. General McCarthy actually gets fired because he basically complains and yells at and calls everybody names in the government, and because he had this thing won basically, and they told him, no, you can't do that, and so he gets fired and can. But that's what Korea is basically about. And just think of it in terms of trying to prevent communism from spreading. We succeeded. So the next president is Dwight Eisenhower. He takes over in 1953. Remember, he's this great famous general from World War II. He's in charge of Operation Overlord, and he's pretty much in charge of all of Europe. And he's very popular. Naturally, that's already a political figure, and you already have figured out we like to elect big generals from our past and then make them president. And so he's no different. He's the last of those kind of guys, though, that are going to become president. And he comes in, and he's a Republican. So we've had all these years of Democrats. Truman kind of became unpopular because of the aftermath of the atomic bombs and so on. And I think people were kind of ready for change. You know, we change parties in the White House about every dozen years. So here comes Eisenhower, again, a very famous, very popular figure. And he says, we're going to stand against communism, and we're going to lower taxes and all this stuff. And the economy is booming, so everybody's pretty happy. And so he does. He takes this really hard stance. But there are a number of things, of course, that take place in the 1950s that are frightening, because we are in the beginning phases of this Cold War. That arms race that we looked at a minute ago is already developing, and people are afraid. As I said, fear is a real problem in the 1950s. If you notice, this manifests itself in several ways. Americans tended to be doing all the same things. If you see pictures of Americans in the 1950s, they're all basically dressed the same. If you look at television programs from the 50s, they all look the same. People kind of talk the same. And I know there's diversity, of course, but they all kind of look and dress the same. And no one really questions anything. They're going to work. They're doing their thing. They're fighting communism in every way that they can. And anything that's beyond that actually is bad. And so there are a number of things that are going on here. And one of them is China versus Taiwan. This is an example of massive retaliation and this containment policy and kind of how this works. So China in the 1950s decides they're going to invade Taiwan. And remember, China never acknowledges that Taiwan's a legitimate government. They say Taiwan is China. The United States recognizes Taiwan as China. It's confusing. It's still kind of confusing. So they threaten to invade Taiwan. Eisenhower says, no, you don't. If you invade Taiwan, we're going to nuke you. And a few months later, China ends up not invading Taiwan. So we have invested a lot of money in Taiwan and a lot of money and time in defending Taiwan. Well, China doesn't invade Taiwan. This actually happens twice in the 1950s. And this is a good example of how history works too. So I'll just take a moment here to kind of get you thinking about what's called historiography, which is how history changes over time. Because I could ask you the question, does history change? And I'll get some people that say yes and some people that say no. Well, they're talking about different things. The events don't change, right? The events of China threatening to invade Taiwan don't change. The events of our response to China's threat don't change. But what does change is what we know about those events, right? What does change is how we feel about those events. So if my father's an engineer, not an academic, but let's suppose he was, and my father was in graduate school getting his PhD in let's say the 1960s, which would be about right, and he decides to get a PhD in history, and he writes this book, because that's what you do to get your PhD, one of the things, and he writes this book about this issue, and he would have gone through all of the research and all of the information, and he would have read it all, and he would say, well, China didn't invade Taiwan because America threatened to nuke China, and China wasn't ready to accept that. And that would be true. The problem is my father would have only had access to information that came from the United States. Now, fast forward, all these years, and let's say it's me now, the son, I go to school and I say, hey, I want to be a historian too, and I go get my PhD, and I decide to write a book on exactly the same thing that my father wrote about. Only now, it'd be the 2000s, I have access to documents from China, from Russia, and more documents from America, and I would read all that. So I've now read 3 times the documents that my father was able to read. And I would come up with a different interpretation of what happened, and they would both be right insofar as the data went. And so data is really important, and the more data you have, the better interpretation you can make. So I'd be able to tell what China was thinking during this period of time, not assuming what China was thinking. In fact, I would learn, for example, that the leader of China said, I don't care if they nuke us, we have more people than they do. We didn't know that at the time. And really what China was doing is the leader was trying to get people back in line, and so he threatens war, and there's nothing like a good war to make people get back in line. Everyone's a patriot, even communists are patriots, and they want to do what's best for their country. And so the reality is, sure, he would have loved to invade Taiwan, but that was never the main goal. But we didn't know that in the 1960s. We know that now. So my book would be on the same topic as my father's, but they would draw different conclusions. And that's how history works. The events don't change, but what we know about them changes and can, and often does, change the way we think about certain events. So that's, again, a long little aside there. Now, other couple things that happened. The Russians put a satellite in outer space first, and it's called Sputnik, and it made America crazy. We thought they were going to be dropping nuclear bombs down on us from outer space. And they said, Eisenhower, why don't we have one of these? And then Khrushchev kind of makes an offhanded comment and saying, we have missiles that'll reach the United States. And America went, Eisenhower, why don't we have these missiles? Why is there a missile gap between the United States and the Russians? Now, I don't know if the Russians had missiles that could reach the United States. I do know that Khrushchev was kind of a loose cannon, and he said things often that weren't necessarily true. I bet you can't imagine a politician doing that. He kind of said things, so whether it was true or not, it didn't matter. It made Americans that much more afraid, that much more paranoid. And of course, Eisenhower then directs the country to launch sort of literally a program to go to space, to go to the moon. This is something Kennedy will really talk about. I mean, you do realize that the moon program wasn't so much about going to the moon, which we did. It's not a conspiracy. But it wasn't so much about going to the moon. That was cool. It was about building better rockets, building better missiles. And we accomplished both of those things, ultimately. So there's some real challenges here that Eisenhower's having to deal with in terms of the spread of communism, in terms of this missile gap and all these sorts of things. And he has a very, very hard line against communism. On the other hand, and this is something that'll come out in one of the documentary videos you watch, I can't remember which one, probably Superpower, but they talk about the economy, and the economy is ridiculous during this period of time. So I'll just highlight a couple things. Most of this will be in your documentary, but the highway system is, as we know it today, is conceived and built by during Eisenhower's administration, or at least it started. So the I-10s and the I-20s and the I-45s, all the big ones, Those were built during this period of time as a measure to make sure that we would be able to move military assets around the country. The side effect is it allowed us to drive our cars around the country, and so that just allowed us more freedom. And of course, it allowed better transportation, better trucking, all these sorts of economic things. But the main reason they did it was a military thing. That's how the federal government justified spending money. It's exactly why they're building this I-14 corridor right here through Killeen, where and the first leg of it is in Killeen, Harker Heights, but it's going to go from Fort Bliss all the way to South Carolina eventually. And the federal government is spending a lot of money on it, and it's going to be a huge highway that connects something like 26 military installations together. The side effect is it'll be great for commerce, and every state and every locality is jumping on board to get it built as soon as possible. Of course, all of this costs money, right? So building the highway system costs money. Having all these military assets around the world costs money. The suburbs are something that are going to be talked a lot about in the documentary, but it's a new way of living. People, because of cars, because of better roads, they're going to move out into the suburbs. But even there, you see that kind of idea that all Americans are the same, and all these houses are the same, and it's sort of mass-produced homes, mass-produced cars, mass-produced everything. And the 50s are very much like that. But people will move into these homes. They'll be able to afford homes. More people than ever will be able to afford homes. And then we also get into this military-industrial complex. That is this marriage of the military and the industry, where these companies now have almost permanent contracts to build tanks, trucks, airplanes, missiles, bombs, whatever. And that's still how it is. And pretty much every modern economy is going to have some element of this military-industrial complex. Even in peacetime, they will be building an awful lot. Here we are in Fort Hood, so there's a huge military connection. But like I said, my father was an engineer. He spent a lot of years working for Caterpillar Tractor, who had probably some military applications, but he spent many more years working for Lockheed, which made missiles and airplanes and space station and all these different things. And again, 3M, which makes Scotch tape, also makes stuff for the military, and Boeing makes passenger planes and fighter planes. That's how it is. And that really gets off the ground as a result of World War II. We saw the capacity we had to build things and to do things, and that's just going to keep going. And the Cold War fuels part of that. So it's kind of going from both sides. We're generating a lot of tax money because the economy is great, but we're also burning a lot of that tax money into these military contracts. And the last bit in this lecture, last but certainly not least, has to do with civil rights. This new civil rights era that is born as a result of World War II. And I think there are a number of reasons why that happened, one of which is everyone in America served in some capacity in this war. Black, white, male, female, and everything in between served in a great capacity in this war, whether it was in uniform or at home in these factories or producing food or whatever the case was. And people started to appreciate one another for their work, not for their skin color. Again, we're a long way from correcting this issue. We still deal with this racial issue in this country. I don't even like that word, but it's still here. But we are going to make huge strides after World War II. Very little happens between the 1870s and the 1940s, unfortunately, in this country. Things tend to get worse, but they are now going to start getting better. So one reason I think is just the general participation by everyone. Two, I think certainly the people that saw it, but the people that heard about it, the stuff that was going on in Europe, in particular with the Jews, I think that jarred a lot of people and made them realize they may not be that far from that. And so you had a lot of that. But also there are some real specific things that happen, one of which is the GI Bill. The GI Bill was developed in 1944, and it was designed to give veterans the ability to go to college, because a lot of the veterans missed out on their chance to go to college because they went to war. And so the GI Bill is going to give those benefits to veterans. Now, it's true that some of the minority groups at first are going to have a real hard time finding it, getting it, and of course they're going to have some of their own programs. But in the end, the GI Bill is going to force open the floodgates of this situation, because we'll take the fact that there are 1 million black veterans. These people are going to want to go to school. They're going to want to go to college, only the colleges aren't really going to let them in because they're segregated because of this racial issue. And so the problem, though, is these soldiers have a piece of paper that says, I am guaranteed these benefits, and you're preventing me from having those benefits. So there's going to be a lot of court cases about this kind of thing all through the 40s and into the 50s. And those cases will be decided differently in different cases, different ways. There won't be a blanket, you have to open up schools until 1954. But it might be a Supreme Court ruling or a state court ruling says to some university, you got to let those students in, even though you're supposed to be segregated, we're telling you to let those 2 law students in. Or they might say you need to build another, building to house all these minority students, because remember, the law of the land was separate but equal is okay. And so that might be how they rule. The point is, they're breaking down these barriers and they're pushing this envelope. And so that generation of Americans who served or served in or fought in or somehow were involved in this situation, they're going to push that envelope. Then comes Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas in 1954, which is about segregating schools by neighborhood. And it challenged directly the idea of separate or equal, because if there was a black neighborhood and a white neighborhood, then there is no way that those schools were ever equal. You and I know that's the case. The black school was never equal to the white school. And what would happen is, if there happened to be a handful of black students who lived in the white neighborhood, and please understand how I'm using these terms as just descriptive, that they would have to be bused all the way to the school in the black neighborhood because they were segregated. And the argument was made and won, and the Supreme Court ruled that that's wrong. You can't do that. And so they outlawed racial segregation in schools. It didn't fix the neighborhood problem. There's still a lot of segregation. And remember, this goes back generations, especially in the South, but it's everywhere. But they do outlaw racial segregation. So a great example of this is Little Rock, Arkansas. There are 9 high school students who are eligible to go to 9 black high school students who are eligible to go to the white school because they live in that side of town, and they're planning on going. Then the governor gets involved, and he gets the Arkansas Guard involved, and he says, no, we're not going to let them do that. And he gives all these excuses like it's going to cause riots. And there were a lot of people that were upset. They didn't want this to happen. But there were a lot of other people that did. And so President Eisenhower hears about this, and he jumps right on it. And he removes the Arkansas National Guard, and he puts in the 101st Airborne. And these guys are dressed in, full battle rattle. They have M16s and bayonets and the whole thing. And they're going to escort these 9 kids to class every day. And Eisenhower says, they are going to go to class. And he just says, we're not doing that. And so in a very big way, Eisenhower steps up into this. Of course, the military by now is going to be desegregated. So that's one of the first things that happens in the late 40s. All through that early 40s, late 40s, early 50s period, they're going to start desegregating the military. So that's a huge step. Now Eisenhower saying, nope, this is going to continue. So he puts the military behind it. Now, that's probably one of the craziest examples of that. But all through the country, this issue is now having to be worked out. But remember, this doesn't deal with the issue of just general segregation and the things that are happening. This is saying in schools, we're not going to have this anymore. Pretty soon that starts to evolve into all other public areas. You think about it, anywhere tax monies are spent, you're going to have to start desegregating. So public transportation is another classic case. And this is where we meet Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks, she was the woman we saw, again, back here on the screen. Here she is sitting on her seat in the bus. She's famous for not giving up her seat when she was told to. And of course, the rule was you had to give up your seat to a white person if need be. And she just finally said, no, I'm not doing that. I don't have to do that. And she ends up getting arrested. And she sort of becomes this poster child for this new, revitalized civil rights movement that develops in the 50s and 60s. And so we can thank the war and the GI Bill and those veterans, and then now Brown versus Board of Education, which was a huge landmark case, which, by the way, overturned the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson case that said separate but equal is okay. Brown versus Board of Education said no, it's not. And that was a good decision, obviously. And so Rosa Parks then comes on the scene. Then you get people challenging this. Freedom riders for several years are going to ride buses into the South to see how far they can get before they get beat up. And sadly, it takes years for this to start to unfold. There are bus boycotts. This is where Martin Luther King comes along. Again, we'll talk more about him in another lecture. But he comes along and he gets involved in these local civil rights issues and walkouts and sit-ins and speeches and involved with the Freedom Riders until he becomes one of the most important, most famous civil rights people in America. And so civil rights, the war really does fundamentally change this country in a whole lot of different ways. And one of those is civil rights. Things are going to improve. Which brings us to the 1960 election. Again, Eisenhower has to step down. We've got new rules in place. You can't be president longer than 10 years now because we thought Roosevelt spent too long. Not because we thought Roosevelt did a bad job, but probably because it killed him. And we just don't want anybody being in power that long. And so we get to 1960 election, which is between Vice President Richard Nixon. And I know when I say Nixon, everybody probably thinks Watergate and bad president. And he certainly earned that reputation. But in 1960, he's super popular. And then he runs against Senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy, who also is super popular. Both guys are pretty young. Both are super popular. Again, I've said that 3 times. Look at the Electoral College map. The difference is not very big. There is a third independent guy named Byrd who does get a handful of votes. Kennedy only got 219 of the votes, which was, again, enough to win. But look how close that is. You usually have something more to one side or the other. And then the popular vote is only about 100,000 votes different. And again, 2 very, very popular candidates. You can see the experienced leader at Nixon. And then you got Kennedy, who's this kind of new, hip guy. This is the first time they're going to have TV debates. And I do think Kennedy just kind of wins those. He comes across a little better. I always like to joke and tell the class, hey, it's because women vote. And of course, Kennedy's better looking than Nixon. I'm kidding, obviously. But we've already discussed in past classes how image does matter. And then now we're on this new medium, the television. And so these candidates have to be able to handle the television. And so Kennedy does. And everyone after that does. Ronald Reagan's a classic example. And then, of course, social media now is the thing. President Obama, President Trump, both in their own way handle social media. So this 1960 election, again, kind of brings out a new way of thinking. So we'll talk Kennedy in the next lecture. It's called Who Shot JFK? We'll talk about Kennedy's presidency, which was very short. And we will then talk about Kennedy's assassination and conspiracy theories, but we'll go on and talk about the 60s and some more civil rights and things like that. So stay tuned for the next lecture.